Hello, hello. Welcome to English Extras. My name is Jean. If you're here, it's because you don't want to sound like a textbook. You're in the right place. This podcast is to help intermediate and advanced learners find alternatives to textbook English so you can express yourself authentically. Before we begin, if you want the transcript for this episode, you can follow the link in the description. Reading and listening at the same time is a great way to improve your English. And I also include definitions of words and phrases I use in the episode, as well as example sentences at the end of each transcript. Ready? Let's begin. If I gave you 20 apples and said, "How many apples did I give you?" but don't say a number, what would your answer be? I'm going to guess that you'd probably say, "You gave me a lot of apples," or "You gave me many apples." Both of these answers are perfectly acceptable, accurate statements. But what other ways can you say it? There are actually quite a few, including the word few, by the way. In this episode, I'm going to share with you a bunch of different ways to refer to a group of nouns, which include people, places, things, and ideas. We're going to start small and work our way up. I'm going to give the phrase, about how much it implies, and an example sentence or two to demonstrate. Starting with the smallest, we have a couple. A couple. When I was a child, I used to argue with my dad about whether a couple only ever meant two. Because in my mind, a couple could also include three things. Now that I'm older, I've realized that yes, a couple refers to two and only two. We see this in other contexts. For example, two people who are in an exclusive relationship are called a couple. So if you want to refer to two things without using the number two, you can say a couple. Let's say you're giving someone two choices. You can say, "You've got a couple of choices here." Or if you want to say you've got an idea or two, you can say, "I've got a couple of ideas." I will say, though, before we move on, that my childhood insistence that a couple can refer to more than two things is supported by the phrase, "a couple of people." Like in the sentence, "I invited a couple of people to dinner tonight." This could mean you invited two people, or three, or even four, depending on the person using the phrase. So there is the possibility of a couple having a looser definition. But in general, the rule of thumb is a couple means two. One step up from a couple is a few. A few is less exact than a couple. It refers to 3 to 5. So me, for example, very rarely can I honestly say I only bought a few books. I would need a much larger phrase to honestly describe how many books I like to buy at one time. After a few, we have several. Now, some people use a few and several interchangeably. But in my experience, and in my opinion, several is more than a few. Several implies anywhere from 4 to 7. So there is some overlap between a few and several. Like relative terms in general, it comes down to personal preference and perspective. If someone said to me, I go to the gym several times a week, I would assume 4 or 5 times. But the person speaking might actually mean 3 times because they might use several and a few interchangeably. If you ever want clarification about exact amounts, you can always say, well, how much is several? Or whatever the phrase happens to be. I've definitely asked this question often in my life because there's many times when I want to fully understand what the other person means by several or a few or many. Don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Moving on, one step up from several, we have a bit of. A bit of. Now, a bit of is hard because it could equal any of the phrases we just discussed. A bit of could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. It depends on what it's referring to. In my experience, a bit of is often used in cooking. I don't know why I have that association, but I do. If you watch a cooking show, I guarantee you will hear the phrase a bit of when talking about salt, sugar, spice, etc. It usually is said while pinching some salt, sugar, spice, etc. between your forefinger and thumb. So whatever amount that is, we can use a bit of to describe it. A tiny step above that is quite a bit of. Quite a bit of. Now, quite is an interesting word. Keep in mind that it can have a different meaning when used in America versus Great Britain. I've heard several British people talk about how quite good is more negative in Great Britain and more positive in America. I can't confirm this from experience, but keep it in mind just in case. In American English, quite is often used as an intensifier. Quite a few is a tiny bit more than a few. Quite a lot is a tiny bit more than a lot. And quite a bit is a tiny bit more than a bit. Continuing with the theme of vagueness and ambiguity, you can also use the phrase a somewhat small amount of, or a somewhat small number of. The somewhat in this phrase strongly implies a relative amount. For example, I used to have a German Shepherd, which is a breed of dog known for its strength, trainability, and work ethic. German Shepherds are often pretty big dogs. So if I told you that my German Shepherd had been somewhat small, I'm implying that she was small compared to other German Shepherds, but not small compared to small breeds such as corgis or bulldogs. Now let's move into larger amounts. The most common way to say there's many of something is to say a lot of. Keep in mind the way native speakers like to say this phrase, especially when said quickly and informally. A lot of will sound like a lotta. A lotta. Lotta. For example, in the sentence, whoa, that's a lot of money. A lotta. A lot of or a lotta doesn't refer to any specific amount. It simply means many of something. Similar to a lot of, we have a bunch of. This is one of my favorites. And again, watch the pronunciation change. A bunch of will often sound like a buncha. A buncha. A buncha. By the way, if you'd like to learn more about this type of pronunciation change, check out episodes 12 and 13 called Patterns of Connected Speech. I go into more detail in those episodes. A bunch of, or a buncha, is one of my favorites because it feels good to say. The pop of the B, the B, the nasality of the N, and the final catch of the ch. I use this in sentences like, I found a bunch of cool things at the peddler's mall. Well, that's more like something my husband would say. He loves peddler's mall more than me. Moving up in amount, we have a ton of. A ton of. This is definitely more than a lot of or a bunch of. But by how much? It's unclear, but it's definitely more. So you can use this in sentences like, I have a ton of books. Because that's true. I have shelves upon shelves upon shelves of books in multiple rooms of my house. So it would probably be inaccurate to say, I have a bunch of books. That doesn't imply the unusually large amount of books I have compared to the average person. It's more accurate to say, I have a ton of books. Above a ton of, we have an enormous amount of. An enormous amount of. I suppose compared to the average person, I could say I have an enormous amount of books. But personally, I feel a ton of is more accurate. I would say that a library has an enormous amount of books, or a bookstore. But me personally, I don't have an enormous amount of books. The last one, the largest on this list, is a huge amount of, or a huge number of. This is not the only phrase we use to describe many, 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 many of something, but it is pretty common. And honestly, you could use it the same as an enormous amount of. Both imply a lot of something. So there you have it. Quite a few options for describing amounts of things, from small things like a couple to big things like an enormous amount. These are all good to have in your back pocket just in case you need alternatives to many. If you'd like the transcript for this episode, check out the description for the link. Until next time, bye.